Is there such a thing as virtue? And what does it mean to live a virtuous life? Furthermore, what does science and philosophy have to say about it? This and more coming up next on Beyond Belief. So, Dr. Pigliucci, you are a philosopher, and which is an unusual profession, I would say, in today's world. And you're a person who promotes philosophy and reason. And one of the things that you have spoken about is the concept of virtue, which I'd like to focus on a little bit today. And the book of yours I'm most familiar with is called Answers for Aristotle, which I loved.
Thank you.
And in it, you say, to be virtuous means to rise above one's weaknesses, to do the right thing, both for ourselves and for others. And obviously that seems like a very reasonable, probably commonly accepted thing to say. But it did raise actually 4 questions that I have on it. And I don't want to belabor the point for too long, but let's just see how it goes. But the first question I would have is, what does it mean to do the right thing? What is the right thing by itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, the answer there depends in part, but I want to stress only in part, on which particular philosophical or religious tradition one belongs to. And the reason I want to stress, in other words, there is cultural variation about what is the right thing to do in any particular circumstance. However, the reason I like to stress the in part is because actually there is a lot of more commonality between traditions and different philosophies and different religions about what, broadly speaking, the right thing to do is. So, for instance, a Stoic philosopher and a Buddhist practitioner might disagree on specific instances, and then they might have to have a conversation about what the right thing to do is. But broadly speaking, they both agreed that we should be helping other people, that we should be reducing suffering, that we should act in a pro-social manner, and so on and so forth. So I would stress the agreement rather than the disagreement. Of course, the disagreements are important. They are a lot of what ethics is actually about. But so long as we accept the notion that ethics is not entirely arbitrary, that there is a lot of variation, culturally speaking, but that doesn't mean that it is arbitrary. It doesn't mean that there is one ethics in Rome and another one in New York. Then we're onto something. If, on the other hand, we disagree with that, if we start from a completely relativistic position about ethics, then it seems to me that there is pretty much no conversation to be had.
Right. I understand. And that makes sense. Okay. So you also said you have to rise above one's weaknesses in order to do the right thing, whatever that right thing may be. And you say there is probably a broad consensus generally of what that thing is. But that would seem to imply that human nature is not equipped naturally to do this. Mm-hmm. So would you say that we are built that way? Is there some fundamental disagreement between our nature and this ideal of doing that which is right?
Right. Well, there too, actually is disagreement among different traditions, right? So the Christians, for instance, tend to think that human beings are pretty bad in the first place. Right? It's like, we really are not doing very well. So it requires a lot of effort on our part to even approximate doing the right thing. The Stoics, on the other hand, by contrast, and a lot of the ancient Greek and Romans thought that actually pretty much human nature is fundamentally good. We are fundamentally pro-social. We're fundamentally cooperative. But then we make mistakes. Then we get into some certain habits that undermine our fundamental goodness. And so we need to work on this. And we need to sort of recover our way. For instance, the Roman Stoic Seneca actually wrote that virtue is nothing other than right reason. And so he says, if you just think about it, and if you think about how you would want to be treated by other people, and then make the very short leap to, well, other people probably want to be treated in the same way, then you're already more than halfway where you should be. So you just need to use your reasoning abilities to figure out what to do and what to stay away from.
I actually have a question about Seneca, but I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. And I'm glad you mentioned it. But two more quick things on virtue, which are, you talk about the contribution of science. I'm gonna get into that a little bit more, also to the development of philosophy and the relationship between the two things. And part of that is evolutionary theory. My question for you is, in your estimation as a philosopher reflecting on the science, why would evolution have selected these negative traits in humanity, these, the desire to do that, something that which is inimical to our own well-being or to society's well-being? Doesn't it seem like an odd phenomena that that it didn't select out the best qualities for us to have very naturally and very easily? That's sort of part one. And part two, if you don't mind, is Ayn Rand. I just wanted to throw her into the mix.
Okay.
She said the highest virtue is to do for one's self, right? So she's, I don't know what to make of her sometimes. Sometimes I like what she says. Sometimes I'm totally baffled. But the question is, how do we know that she wasn't correct? Maybe that is a higher virtue than doing for others. Maybe yourself is the most important thing to focus on.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. You brought up Ayn Rand. Yeah, we'll get to her in a minute.
Okay.
So let's go first to evolution. So before I turned to philosophy a number of years ago, I actually was an evolutionary biologist, and so that has given me a different way of looking at things compared to some of my colleagues in philosophy. I think that evolution. So the question is, why did evolution not eliminate certain traits that are not good for us? Well, the question is, what is good for us? And from the point of view of natural selection, there is only two things that matter: survival and reproduction. In fact, there really is only one thing that matters: reproduction. Survival is because if you don't survive, usually you don't reproduce.
Generally, yes.
Right, generally speaking. So natural selection clearly doesn't care. Well, technically doesn't care about anything because it's not a sentient thing, but doesn't care, metaphorically speaking, about flourishing, about achieving, personal satisfaction, about wealth, about anything other than things that are instrumental for survival and reproduction. Now, therefore, I would think that basing an ethics entirely and exclusively on natural selection would be a bad idea. However, ignoring natural selection, ignoring evolution is also a bad idea. And the reason for that, I think, again, goes back to one of the fundamental ideas that were developed by the Greco-Roman philosophers, especially the Stoics, but also the Epicureans. They thought that we should live, as they put it, according to nature.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that we should all of a sudden strip naked and go into the forest and hug trees, although nothing wrong with that if you want to do it, but that's not what they meant. What they meant was, look, we are human beings. If the question here is to try to figure out what is a good life for a human being, then we need to understand the basics of human nature. Because you cannot possibly work toward a good life unless you actually take into account what human nature entails and what kind of needs and wants are typical of human beings. So let me give you a completely different example. Let's say that a friend of yours comes over for dinner and brings you as a present a cactus.
Okay.
So now you are in charge of the cactus. And in order for the cactus to thrive, in order for you to allow the cactus to thrive, you have to know something about cactus nature. The first obvious thing you have to know is that it's a plant, and therefore it needs water and light, among other things. But just as importantly, you actually need to know that it's not just a plant, it's a desert plant, which means that it requires a lot of light and actually fairly little water. If you start watering your cactus on a regular basis, as if it were another house plant, you're going to kill it. Why? Because you didn't take cactus nature into account. So the Stoics and the Epicureans, even though they themselves disagreed on the fine details of these things, said, well, the same goes for a human being. If my question is, what is a good life for a human being, what the Greeks called the eudaimonic life, a life worth living, then I had to ask myself, what is a human being in the first place? According to the Stoics, a human being is characterized, of course, by a number of things that we have in common with other animals, right? We need food, we need water, we need protection, we want sex. All of those things are in common with other animals. And they do need to be taken care of. You're not going to have a good life if you're starving or dying of thirst or anything like that. But then they also ask themselves, yes, but what is specifically human that you either don't find in other animals or you find to a much, much lesser degree? In other words, what is it makes a human a particular kind of animal just in the way in which a cactus is a particular type of plant and not just a genetic plant? And the answer there was, according to the Stoics, two things. We are highly prosocial, we're highly cooperative, and we are capable of reason. In fact, in modern terms, we would say that social life and reason are the two weapons that natural selection gave us in order to survive and reproduce, right? We don't have big teeth, we don't have large muscles, we don't run fast, we don't fly, we don't do any of the stuff that other animals do. But what we do is we cooperate in a very highly coordinated, complex fashion with other human beings in order to achieve our goals. And we use reason. We have a very sophisticated ability to reason, far more than any other animal on earth. So for the Stoics, for instance, therefore, from this follows that a good human life, the kind of life that we want to have for every human being, is one in which we're capable of exercising reason, and we do so mostly in with the scope, with the objective of improving social living. And that gets me to Ayn Rand. So if that's true, then Ayn Rand is wrong. And,
right. Okay.
And Ayn Rand is wrong for the simple reason that it is certainly the case, of course, that we do things for ourselves. I mean, we do want to thrive. You know, I want to thrive as a person. I want to not only survive and perhaps reproduce. I mean, I do have one daughter, but I also want to thrive. I want to do things that are interesting to me, et cetera, et cetera. But because I am an inherently social animal, those things are simply not possible if I start looking out only for number one. I have to be cooperative because that is the nature of human life. So in a sense, yes, ultimately, everything we do is because we want to survive, reproduce, and have a good life. But we cannot do that by acting in a selfish fashion because we're not solitary animals. If we were a different kind of animal, you know, let's say a Martian comes in tomorrow and it turns out the Martians did not evolve as social animals, then they would have a different kind of ethics. Or in fact, they might not have an ethics at all in that sense. I mean, let's not forget that ethics, although today we understand ethics and morality in general as limited to the study of right and wrong, right? So the typical thing is you ask an ethical or moral questions. Well, is this action right or wrong? That's pretty much what we think today. But in Greco-Roman times, rightly, I think, ethics and morality, which is just the Latin translation of ethics from the Latin, right? So it's Cicero that just translated ethikos as moralis. So the two were essentially equivalent.
And as you're speaking, I'm just thinking like human beings strike me as very schizophrenic, you know, having these very different kinds of needs and, you know, often agreeing on these overarching sort of lofty goals and often falling quite short of reaching those goals, and sort of indulging in these more base aspects, you know, of ourselves. But I appreciate all of your answers and your exploration of the concept of virtue. But let me pivot for a second onto science and values, which is another thing you talk about. And I like the term that you've come up with, sci-fi, you know, for science and philosophy. And to quote you once again, you say our philosophy can and should be informed by the best science available and vice versa. Our quest for scientific knowledge should be guided by our values. Okay, again, seems very sensible. But what happens in the case where science itself demonstrates that there are no objective values, as some people believe? You know, we can talk about ethics, morality, values, whatever we want to call them. But if you take a cold, hard look at the universe, as some people have, and have concluded, you know, I don't see any values, I don't see any ethics. You know, I just see either atoms smashing into each other in different configurations, or I see like short, nasty, brutish, you know, experience, and I'm just, as you said, just trying to survive. Right. So, what does the word value mean in the context of a scientist or a philosopher who concludes that way?
Right. That's a great question, and let's see if we can walk through it in a sensible way. So I try to strike a middle ground between two positions that I find both problematic and in my mind at least, indefensible.
Okay.
One position is known in philosophy as moral realism. So this is the idea that there are, in fact, absolute rules of morality, of moral behavior. The typical moral realist is Kant, for instance, who thinks that you just think about it. If you just think rationally about things, then you'll arrive at what he called the categorical imperative, right? This notion that you should never accept any kind of behavior as moral unless you would be okay with that behavior being a universal rule, right? So, for instance, lying is a bad idea because if everybody went around lying, then we would literally not have a society. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Now, of course, the other big chunk of moral realism comes from religious traditions, most religious traditions, not necessarily all of them. Certainly the Abrahamic faiths, the three big ones in the Middle East and West. Why? Well, because there you have God that gives you something, literally gives you something like the commandments or any kind of sort of rule for life, and that's it. That's what morality comes from. So that's one extreme. I think that's not tenable. It's not tenable because I don't think, it sounds to me like essentially a moral realist is the moral equivalent, the ethical equivalent of a mathematical Platonist, somebody who believes that there's this kind of realm of ideas that is somehow mind independent. And I cannot make sense of that. I mean, we could go into details, but it would take some time for why it doesn't make sense. But it's just a weird way of thinking about it. I don't think that there is any such thing as a mind-independent morality or moral rules. Now, you go to the opposite extreme, and you find a number of different ways of being an anti-realist about morality. And the most obvious one being a relativist, right? Somebody who just says, no, sorry, whatever I think is one thing, whatever you think is another thing. One interesting type of anti-realist are emotivists, who basically say that when we say that something is good or bad, or something is evil, etc., all we're doing is just emoting. We're just saying, I don't like this.
Yes.
That sounds to me just as bizarre as moral realism, because that basically reduces morality to a matter of taste. And I'm having a hard time thinking that my distaste for vanilla ice cream is on the same level as my distaste for rape or genocide. Yes, I do have a distaste for rape and genocide, as it turns out, but I actually have an alternative explanation for why we feel moral distaste, and that does come from science. Turns out that modern cognitive science and evolutionary biology do actually suggest that the reason we have such strong moral feelings of distaste for certain kinds of behaviors is because we share those with other social primates, such as the bonobo chimpanzees, for instance. And that therefore these feelings of strong distaste evolved in us precisely because they favor a pro-social behavior. So bonobo chimpanzees and early humans were not able to articulate why something is morally disgusting or morally acceptable, but they did evolve an instinct for something that is, in fact, acceptable or not acceptable. And interestingly, studies on other primates show that pretty much the same kind of things that we would think are moral or immoral, they also find acceptable or distasteful, which means that, to me at least, it suggests that there actually is this third way where you can have what I call a quasi-realism or a semi-objective morality, meaning that there are some rules of behavior that make sense and are advantageous if you live in a group with other people. For instance, don't go around beating others at random, right? Don't steal from others. Don't kill others at random unless there is a good reason for it, et cetera, et cetera. All of those basic things, they're not just shared across human societies. There's basically no cultural variation about that. There's no human society that condones random murder. They condone death, killing for certain specific reasons.
Right. They'll just redefine murder,
well,
as to what is most convenient for them. But yes.
Sure. But the point is, there has to be a reason, and the reason itself is regulated. Right? There's no society where people just go around randomly and killing or beating each other up or stealing from each other. And the same is true for other societies of other primate species. Now, the thing is, however, we now live, and by now I mean at least in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, probably more, we live in societies that are far more structured, far larger, and far more complex than ancestral human societies. Ancestral human societies were not very different from the kinds of society that we find in bonobo chimpanzees. There were small bands of people mostly related to each other. Right? The estimate by paleoanthropologists is 60, 80, 100 people, usually brothers, sisters, uncles, nephews, and so on and so forth. In those kinds of groups, simple instinctual behavior that has been put in place by natural selection is sufficient to regulate group behavior. You don't need a lot more than that. You don't need Kant to come in and start talking about morality. But once we start having large cities with structured division of labor, with hierarchical structures and so on and so forth, where most people are not related to each other and most people actually don't know even each other, then you need something more. And that was one of the great, I think, insights of the Stoics, and which is one of the most underappreciated of those. The Stoics thought that essentially they came up with a theory of what we would today call moral developmental psychology. They thought, look, naturally speaking, we are like other social animals. We have this instinct for collaboration. We have this instinct for taking care of our kins and our close relatives, etc., etc. But once then we get into the age of reason, what they call the age of reason, which starts around 8, 9 years old, something like 7, 9 years old, and then into adulthood, we start thinking more abstractly, and we start realizing that those kind of instinctive behaviors are just not enough. We need to come up with more articulate rules of behavior because the society at large is more complex, and we need to coexist not just with our kins and friends, but with potentially thousands or even millions of people. And that's where moral philosophy comes in. That's where we start talking about, okay, so how do we put together rules or general ways of behaving that are good for society and that allow individuals to thrive? And there is, of course, where we also start having cultural variation, right? Because different cultures are structured in different ways, different societies have different characteristics, so you will find variation. Although, as I said before, far less than you might imagine. I've been talking about the Greco-Roman tradition, but for instance, you find very similar practical applications of ethics in Confucian philosophy in China, or in Buddhist philosophy in India, and so on and so forth. So that's my idea. The idea is that, therefore, what we call morality is actually a result of two things: of a natural instinct that really did evolve organically because we're social animals on the one hand, and that is not universal in the sense that it applies, it's mind independent, but it isn't random either. It's not completely arbitrary either. On top of which, we as sentient thinking human beings start putting other things which are also, although variable, not random and not arbitrary, because they're constrained by facts about human nature, by facts about human societies, right? So there is room for variation, but only within certain limits. And the result of all of this is a type of ethics that depends on two things: of knowledge about human wants and needs. That's where the science comes in. Facts. We need facts about what makes a society thrive, what makes human beings do well. And those facts, therefore, are the province, in my mind, of science. Combined with philosophy, meaning reasonable thinking, rational thinking. Now, remember, Seneca was saying, reason is nothing other than virtue is nothing other than right reason. So these two things, that's why the sci-fi, that's why the science and the philosophy, because the science by itself does not tell you enough to identify human values in a practical fashion. But philosophy by itself cannot either, because it cannot do it without knowing facts about the human condition.
So one quick follow-on to that, and I understand what you're saying. The science is informing the behavior and sort of pointing the way towards maximizing our cooperation for the purpose of survival and flourishing. But when I'm listening to it, I'm trying to distinguish, like, what is the difference between that and, you know, the thriving of a termite colony, or, you know, a clump of pine trees, or, you know, is there any particular value that's better for humans to thrive? There seems to be something very distinct, you know, about the import of the choices that we make, that seems just somehow different than, like, well, this is the best way for us to survive and reproduce, as you have said. Doesn't there seem like there's something in there that's missing?
Yes and no. The thing that is missing is this stuff here. The human brain is far more complex, of course, than ants and termites and things like that, not to mention forests, because trees don't even have brains. What does that mean? It means that we don't just want to survive and reproduce. We want that too, most of the times. But not just that. We have, again, evolved far more sophisticated requirements for thriving in life than pretty much any other human being. Now, this isn't natural. I don't think this is the result of natural selection. I think this is cultural evolution that has taken off on the basis of human biology, and it started doing its own thing. Once the human brains became large enough to start entertaining sophisticated thoughts, abstract thinking, and stuff like that, then we started having additional needs, culturally evolving additional needs, such as, hey, I want to have a career that is fulfilling. That's got not much to do with, you know, reproduction and survival. I want to spend my leisure time by traveling, you know, or things like that. Or I want to read a good book, or whatever it is that tickles your fancy. Those things are not direct results of natural selection. Natural selection has nothing to do with that sort of stuff. But natural selection created the brains large enough that now, as a byproduct, we do have new needs. And those new needs are far more complex, and therefore they require a far more sophisticated ethics than what's good enough for chimpanzees, gorillas, and things like that. But it is important to remember that it started there, because if we forget that, then we don't have a naturalistic explanation for ethics. Right. So one of the most influential modern writers, modern philosophers in this department is Philippa Foot, who wrote a wonderful book called Natural Goodness, where she makes essentially the same argument that I just made. In fact, it's the same argument that Aristotle and the Stoics were making. That is, we are connected with other social species, particularly primate species. And that's where we get this old notion and these old instincts about morality and ethics and pro-sociality and stuff like that. But at the same time, now we also want a bunch of other things that other species on Earth don't want. And now, how do we get them? Well, you know, I cannot spend my life reading, writing, going to a concert, or going to a vacation if we are in a Hobbesian state of war and conflict. Right? Yeah, just ask the people of Ukraine right now.
Yes. I was going to say. Okay, let me ask you. I'd like to sort of emote to you as a theologically minded person for a moment, if that's okay.
Sure.
It's not really emoting, but I'll ask you a two-part question. You write, science is not in the business of delivering permanent truths, but offers instead provisional conclusions that have a certain probability of being true.
Right.
That makes perfect sense. And it's honest, and you know, I do think that there is some elements of the scientific community that certainly speaks with a lot more certainty than that.
And they should, right?
Yeah, but okay. So you know, there are many studies that are cited. You know, we know this because of this study. We know this because of this study. We know that there are retractions and revisions, and you know, things end up changing often. You know. And so I think it does make sense to have a certain amount of humility and a certain amount of open-mindedness when it comes to scientific conclusions. And I appreciate the fact that you've written that and that's your position. What I've found is that when theists or spiritually minded people they want to use certain scientific or philosophical arguments. So, for instance, the argument from biological design, which has to do with
Right.
unlikelihood of even a protein randomly assembling, and there are mathematical figures and stats and whatnot, or the fine-tuning arguments, which has to do with the likelihood of the various rates of gravitation, the weak, strong nuclear force, and so on, being tuned exactly the way they are, the great unlikelihood of that, or even Big Bang cosmology, which seems to point to a certain origin of the universe. I've had the enormous pleasure over the last year or so of interviewing some of the smartest and most accomplished people I've ever come across in my life. And I find that when I ask some of them these questions, all of a sudden their scientific confidence becomes very open and muddled.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what happened in the initial conditions of the universe. That first fraction of a second, I can't really say. And who knows, science is going to come up with other ideas to explain it. From my vantage point, there doesn't seem to even be there doesn't seem to be an openness at a certain point. It comes to sort of like an end. No, we won't consider that. We won't draw that conclusion.
Right.
And I don't know if I have a specific question, but it's more, can you reflect upon all of that?
Yeah, those are all good questions. Absolutely. I think that I would agree with my colleagues that you just mentioned that when it comes to certain questions, you just have to say, I don't know. I mean, if you ask me what came before the Big Bang, it's, nobody knows. And moreover, in fact, I would even go further. Probably nobody will ever know. I say probably, not certainly, but probably nobody would ever know. Why? Well, because there are no historical traces left, right? There's nothing. I mean, in order for science to work, you got to have some kind of empirical evidence. And if the Big Bang is the kind of process that we think it is, there is a sudden fluctuation in a pre-existing quantum singularity, whatever that means. I'm not a physicist. If it is if it's that, then there is nothing left of assuming that there was something before that might explain the origin of that quantum singularity. There is nothing left. And if there is nothing left, you are like in a situation of a Sherlock Holmes who has absolutely no traces of the crime. What are you going to do? Nothing. So you're just going to say, I don't know. And I think that saying I don't know, not just on the part of scientists, but on the part of pretty much anybody, is a salutary reminder that, yeah, sometimes that's the only acceptable answer. We don't know. Now, in some other cases that you mentioned, I think the reason that scientists tend to be dismissive or skeptical of sort of going into the transcendental, let's call it the transcendental direction.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, but rooted in actual science.
Yeah. So of course, yes.
Yeah.
But the reason we tend not to go in those directions is one of two. There are basically two reasons. One, sometimes those arguments are actually bad or have been at this point refuted or have lost credibility. For instance, the argument from design. You do find the argument from design in ancient sources. You find it in the Stoics. You find it in a lot of the Greek and Romans. And at the time, it made perfect sense. However, after Hume first, and then Darwin next, and then all of 20th century and 21st century science, it doesn't, because we have a lot of good answers, even if there might be tentative and incomplete answers. We have a good answers, for instance, to where do the complex biological structures come from? Well, now we have a good, solid science of to explain the evolution of the eye, for instance, which was one of the classic examples of alleged intelligent design. So I looked into, as a biologist, I looked for many years into those arguments, and I just find them wanting at this point. So when a scientist rejects them and says, "No, I'm sorry, there's no need to go there," I think they are on fairly solid grounds. The second reason the transcendental option is rejected is because even in situations where we don't really have an answer at all, let's say the Big Bang, for instance, right? If the question is what came before the Big Bang, well, yeah, science doesn't have an answer, but neither does anybody else. To say something like, well, God did it, it's not really an answer. It's just a fancy label for saying I have no idea what happened there. Because unless you can give me some evidence, first of all, that God did it, you can tell me something about the structure and functioning of God and how he actually did it, those would be actually explanations. Those will count as explanations. But if you're saying is, well, God did it, that is essentially a fancy and unnecessary label to the same thing that I just said, which is, I don't know. And at that point, then why do you want to add an additional label, which of course implies a whole other realm of existence of which we have no evidence nor reason to think that it's there. So now, does that mean that it is not there? Does that, could I go so far as saying no, that clearly God doesn't exist? No, I'm not going to go there. I don't. But the point is, I don't need to go there because there is no there to go to be going in terms of explanations. It's just not an explanation. At least nothing that counts as what a philosopher and a scientist would consider an explanation. And I think that's why a lot of scientists are perfectly comfortable saying I don't know, but they don't think that implies anything else other than I don't know.
Can I clarify a little bit?
Sure.
A little bit more. Okay, so even granting regular Darwinian evolution, right? That takes hold once you've got a self-replicating cell. You know, my question is more in the abiogenesis realm, like how we got from inanimate to animate.
Yep.
And in that regard, it seems to me, as not a scientist and not a philosopher, that it seems to me that the science says that the chances of that actually happening are so infinitesimally small that it would be reasonable to posit a cause and a cause that is ostensibly of great creative ability, massive creative ability, whatever that cause may be, and whatever label we might give to it. Right now, the state of play, it seems to me, is a total wall in terms of understanding how it got that way. And I just want to quote to you really quickly from James Shapiro from the University of Chicago on.
Oh yeah, I know James.
Okay, on evolution itself, and to get your whole reaction to all this, but he says Neo-Darwinism ignores much contemporary molecular evidence and invokes a set of unsupported assumptions about the accidental nature of heredity variation. Neo-Darwinism ignores important rapid evolutionary processes such as symbiogenesis, horizontal DNA transfer, and a bunch of other things. Moreover, some neo-Darwinists have elevated natural selection into a unique creative force that solves all the difficult evolutionary problems without real empirical basis. And he's got this whole website which is searching for the third way in evolution. It does not embrace creationism, does not embrace neo-Darwinism, and is hopeful for some other approach. So given all that, especially on the abiogenesis question, don't we have some question to look at here? Isn't this a remarkable phenomena?
We have lots of questions to look at. I wish good luck to James. I don't think he's going to get anywhere. In fact, he has been trying to do what he's been trying to do for a long time and hasn't gotten anywhere. Look, the origin of life is another one of those things that we may never actually get an answer to. And for the same exact reason that I mentioned before, the origin of life on Earth, the estimate is, took place between 3.8 and 4.1 billion years ago. Well, there is no rock that survived from that time. So there is no fossil record. So there's nothing that is going to tell us how it happened. The only way we have to move forward, and in fact, that's the only way that scientists have tried so far, is to imagine possible pathways and then do experiments under controlled conditions to see, well, do those pathways work or not? And the result of it is that right now we have at least 3 or 4 different possibilities that are at play, none of which is anywhere near where we would like it to be. So the short answer is we don't know. We have some ideas, unlike the Big Bang, which is better than the Big Bang, because before the Big Bang, we have really no idea. But in terms of origin of life, we do, simply because we can base those ideas on biochemistry, and which is itself based on chemistry. So we have some notion of what might have happened. But again, it's one of those crimes, to use the metaphor of Sherlock Holmes, where we don't have, it's not true that we don't have any evidence at all, but we have very little evidence to go by. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we wouldn't make much progress, even in the next several decades. But again, what does that mean? That the only thing that entails is, okay, so I don't know. And when James says, all that bit about Neo-Darwinism was never meant to explain the origin of life. Darwin himself is very clear about this.
Right.
So to shoot at Neo-Darwinism as, they failed to explain the origin of life is like, why are you doing this? That's like...
You'll have to ask him.
Right. Actually, lots of people have asked him.
Okay.
But, so it makes no sense to me, because it is really trying to use the wrong tool to answer that kind of question. The answer isn't going to be, of the origin of life isn't going to come from Neo-Darwinism. It's going to come from biophysics. If it's coming at all, of course.
Right. Okay. I think I have time for 1.5 more questions, although I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. We spoke about, you spoke about Stoicism, and that is one of your areas of expertise. And you mentioned Seneca, and we've spoken about virtue and ethics. And here's something that I've learned about Seneca. So it says, the wealthy first century Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote, "We doom scabby sheep to the knife, lest they should infect our flocks. We destroy monstrous births, and we drown our children if they are born weakly or unnaturally formed. To separate what is useless from what is sound is an act not of anger, but of reason." This from a Stoic who supposedly believed virtue to be the highest good. Notably, Seneca was Nero's tutor. So is there some kind of contradiction between the Stoic ideals of, of virtue and how they actually enacted them? Does the individual child, even if, malformed, have value in the Stoic realm, or, have our values simply shifted over time?
Yeah, it's another good question. There's many ways of answering it. One way is by analogy. So, as you know, during the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, Christian popes literally went into battle to slaughter enemies, dressed with armor. Does that imply that Christianity is a warmongering sort of religion? I would say no, right? It just means that those particular people were not enacting a particularly good version of Christianity. So I think that we need to make a distinction between the person, the specific person we're talking about, in this case, Seneca, and what the philosophy entails. Seneca was a really brilliant person. He was a great writer. He was a playwright, and he had a really difficult situation in his hands. He had to handle the Emperor Nero for many years, and he apparently did a pretty good job actually for several years, until eventually things got out of hand, and Seneca paid with his life because he was ordered to commit suicide by Nero. However, Seneca was also a human being. In fact, he's himself, and therefore he's not only flawed, as human beings tend to be, but also the product of his culture and time. The kind of practices you're talking about made perfect sense for ancient Romans. They would say, we don't have enough resources to have all these children going up and occupy space and taking food, so we need to get to essentially do selection of these things. Is that acceptable for us today? Hell no. Right? But we live in a different, and I would say, despite our own flaws, better society. Right? I mean, I wouldn't want to go, as much as I love the Greco-Romans, I wouldn't want to find myself living in ancient Athens or ancient Rome unless I was one of the really top elite. And even there, actually, they didn't have as good a life as probably middle class.
They didn't have plumbing, yeah.
That's right. No plumbing, no television series. Okay, wait a minute. That's actually a blessing. But, et cetera, et cetera. Also, Seneca was very honest. If you read his letters to his friend Lucilius, which is essentially an informal curriculum in Stoic philosophy, he says over and over, he says, don't come to me for advice, because I'm not a sage. I'm just sick as you are. I am simply just slightly ahead of you because I'm older and I realized earlier that I was sick, but that's about it, right? So it's endearing in that sense, because you are then more prone to sort of forgiving for the fact that he was not living to the highest levels of his own philosophy. But there were Stoics who were. Epictetus would probably be my choice, my favorite choice. He was born a slave in the middle part of the 1st century, and became eventually one of the most famous and sought after teachers of the early part of the 2nd century. And by all accounts, we don't know a lot, unfortunately, about his life, but all that we know about his life, he really lived his philosophy. He really was a modest person with, not interested in wealth and fame and stuff like that. And he was trying to do his best to help his students. But I think the broader question really is, when we're talking about either philosophies or religions, by the way, I tend to think of religions as a type of philosophy anyway.
So do I.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that the real question is, what does that religion and or philosophy entail logically, as opposed to what did this particular person who claimed to be a Christian, Muslim, Stoic, Epicurean, et cetera, actually did. It's always fascinating to study individuals, of course, because philosophies and religions ought to be lived. And that is therefore one good reason to look critically, obviously, at the lives of people like Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. Plutarch wrote a entire book on the parallel lives, precisely with the notion of teaching us about what good models of a human life might be, as well as bad models of a human life. Right? This was a moral book, and so it's really important to look at the lives of these people critically, not as if we were looking at heroes or saints or anything like that. But I think it's far more important to look at what the philosophies themselves say. So, for instance, to go back to your original example, I think that the sort of cultural practices that were common in Rome that you mentioned are not compatible with Stoic philosophy. And the reason for that is because Stoic philosophy is fundamentally about caring for other people. It's a cosmopolitan philosophy. It's a philosophy, therefore, that doesn't recognize national boundaries, that says that we should treat other people as our brothers and sisters. And that's not the kind of thing you would do to your brother or sister.
Right.
Right. Therefore, if we're talking about what does Stoicism entail, it certainly would reject that sort of behavior. But Seneca lived in a Roman society of the 1st century where that kind of behavior was standard, and therefore he was telling us how things were, and make the best of it.
Well, Dr. Pigliucci, this has been a really fun and meaningful conversation, and I can't thank you enough for having taken the time to speak with me today. And I encourage everyone to go out and check out your many volumes that are worth looking at and reading, and getting a great TED Talk that you have. And for the audience, please subscribe, like, and share the content today, and stay abreast of all the great content that we have coming up now and going forward. Thank you all for being here.